This is the school food waste and composting training. Let's dive in with Corey, the compost worm. One of the things I really like about community composting is that there are so many different ways you can do it. It can be on a tiny little piece of land, or it can take up a huge full field. In this section, we're going to be looking at all the different options you have, from tumblers, bins, piles, windrows, aerated systems, closed vessel systems, and worm composting. Let's talk about setting up a school composting program. There are a lot of systems you can choose from when you're setting up your compost site. Tumblers are closed vessels. They come in all different sizes. Many of them sit up off the ground, and they're a really good system for starting food scraps in because it prevents animals from getting into it. It can cut down on odors, and it takes away a little bit of that ick factor. There are single bin systems, which come in all shapes and sizes. Many schools opt for the multiple bin system. So this can range from 2 bins up to however many you have space for. If you have empty or additional bins, they can be used for carbon storage or for curing your compost, which is the last stage before the compost is ready to be used. Just a note about bin construction, regardless of the material that you build it from. If you have some kind of equipment that you're going to be using to get into those bins to move the material or to aerate, be sure you have that in mind when you're designing your bin systems so that you can actually get that equipment in. Some of the larger bins you'll notice have slats in front that can actually be lifted out. So it's essentially a closed system, but then you can, when you're ready to get into that particular bin, you pull those slats out, and that allows easier access. There's also piles and windrows. If you're using piles or windrows, you want to have them be a minimum of 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall. They can be as long as you have room for or as you need. Part of the shape that you're going for will naturally create that draw of air from the bottom, and it'll circulate through the pile or windrow and come out the top. And that's part of how you get that hot compost happening, and you can maintain the proper aeration for your system. You always want to cap a pile or windrow with either wood chips, some kind of other carbon material, or finished compost or soil to act as a biofilter so that prevents odors, and also to prevent animals from being attracted by those odors and getting into your food scraps. There are schools that utilize windrow system, like this one in Swale High School in Philadelphia. Here you can see on the left a nice long windrow. It's covered with soil. And on the right is this compost turning machine that actually runs, it straddles the windrow and turns it as it runs all the full length of the windrow. There's also aerated static piles. Aerated static piles use perforated pipe underneath the pile or windrow. There's the passive aerated piles where just the perforations just allow sort of a pathway for air to get underneath the pile, and then it comes up through the pile, through the composting material. There's also active aerated piles, so that's attached to a fan or a blower of some sort, and those can actually either push air through or pull air back through. So you can change the direction of the air that's going through the pile depending on your management needs. Closed vessel systems are becoming very popular for schools and other institutions, small businesses. They're entirely enclosed, but they're still aerated, so it's rotating, so it's moving. In this way, it's completely cut off from potential animal interaction, which is good. This is one model here at the Dirt Factory at University City. Here's another rotating drum in vessel compost system that was developed by North Country School in Lake Placid. It's also now being used at Lake Placid High School, at Herman DeKalb Central School, and at other locations, primarily in New York right now. This particular design is open source, free for anybody who's interested, and it comes with a lot of ideas for modification. You feed the materials in one side, and it It's rotating. By the time it comes out the other side, you see on the right here, it looks like finished compost, but it still needs to go through that secondary decomposition phase and the curing phase. So it's not quite ready to be used, but it is effectively managing and treating all of your food scraps in vessel. Of course, there's worm composting as well, or vermicomposting. There's a whole variety of different bins and boxes for that, different systems. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more later on about the details of vermicomposting specifically in schools. And then there are what I call integrated systems. And so this is basically when you set up a system that's utilizing more than one of those particular systems. In Vermont, we have a lot of schools and community gardens and other community-based composting sites that utilize a tumbler for that initial decomposition of the food scraps with a higher carbon material like wood shavings. After 2 to 3 weeks, when those food scraps are fairly broken down, they empty the tumbler, put it into a bin system, add other carbon sources like leaves, they might add manure, whatever other feedstocks you have, and then it goes through the bin system. Some people take that pre-digested or partially decomposed material from a tumbler and integrate it into their worm systems as well. Worms really like that partially decomposed material. So there's just a bunch of different ways that you can configure your system that you can think about when you're setting it up. Some schools in Vermont have laying hens as well, and there are guides for how to integrate laying hens into an active compost system also. In terms of other equipment and supplies, we're certainly thinking about gloves and masks now. They were always recommended and a good idea, but many sites are doubling down on those personal protective equipment. For moving and managing your organic materials, you have shovels and pitchforks. Some sites use a bobcat, you can use a tractor, compost turners. And for the tumblers that are those smaller in-vessel systems, often you'll need trowels or some kind of hand tool. Ideally, you would have some sort of covered area or additional bin that you keep your carbon in to keep that dry. For hot composting, you definitely need some type of composting thermometer and then screens for that final finishing step. Things to think about when you're setting up your site. There are 6 primary steps to the compost system, and having this in mind when you're laying out your site can make it a lot more logistically functional. So the first step is having your organics intake. Where are you bringing your food stock in, or those carbon sources, having a place for a farmer to drop off manure, whatever it is that you're utilizing. You need a feedstock preparation area that may be one and the same if you're using a tumbler system. It varies a little bit depending on system. It also may vary depending on where the food scraps are being prepared or where they're coming from. So are they chopped up? Are you taking waste from your school garden and you have some larger pumpkins or squash? Those need to be chopped up. If it's coming from a cafeteria or from individual classrooms, chances are the scraps will already be in relatively small pieces. You have your active composting area where it actually is going to get hot and you integrate all the carbon and nitrogen. We'll talk about recipe development a bit later, but you need space for that. And then you need a curing space where compost can just sit and finish off. You want that to be a stable product at the end, remember, so not something that is still going to heat up if it's moved or aerated. And then a sifting area if you're going to be sifting your final product. And then again, depending on what you're doing with your final finished compost, either a distribution area or someplace for it to store until it's ready to be used on your athletic field, on just your grass. You can top dress your grass with it at the school or for mulching with it, or in a school garden. So let's look at these different steps a little bit more in depth. You have your food scrap collection, whether it's in a cafeteria or just in a classroom. Depending on where your site is, you may need to bring that in a pickup truck or in a larger bin to your compost site if it's not right there handy at your school. There's a lot of different containers and bins and ways for moving this stuff around. Remember that quality is vital to success, and we'll talk about communication in a little bit, but you want to be sure that people understand what it is you're accepting in your system and what you're not accepting in your system. So you're really taking care of that first step of quality control at the source, and then as you're adding it into your system, the people managing the system should also be trained in this so they can have an eye and have, be pulling out anything that may have made its way through. A lot of classrooms and other compost sites, depending on where you're gathering, may have a bin of wood shavings where they are actually like in your classroom at the end of snack time, put a yogurt container of wood shavings over them. That'll help keep the odors down. That's just getting carbon right covered on it immediately. And then if you're using that type of system, you just want to note how much carbon was being added at that first step, because that'll impact your recipe when you add it into your full system. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different ways for preparing your feedstock. So chopping up the bigger pieces of food scraps, mixing it with the carbon. Again, that might happen in layers right in a bin or being tumbled together in a tumbler. And then you have your active composting areas. I'm going to show a bunch of different pictures of what this looks like, really just to give you an idea that there's no right or wrong way. There's no best cookie cutter approach for how to set up your system. It depends on the space you have available. It depends on how many people are going to be managing it. Depends on the volume of food scraps you're going to be managing or that you want to manage. So all of these things go into play. Here in this picture is St. Albans City Elementary School. I guess I should say another factor is cost, right? So or materials that you have available. St. Albans City Elementary School through a grant, was able to get a number of these soil saver bins and Jora tumblers. And so instead of building one of those long rows of wooden bins, they just have these individual bins, and that actually allows them to assign them to different groups of students to manage their own. Multiple groups of students can be taking temperatures at the same time. Here, it's not really evident in this picture, but signage is really important. So labeling your bins, which are active, which are you actively adding fresh food scraps to, which are already the recipe has been made and it's just sitting and waiting, going to be turned out in a week or two, or where is the curing pile, because you don't want to be adding fresh scraps into your curing bin, right? Because then you have to start that process all over again. We'll be talking more about signage in a little bit. Here's an example of one of those long rows of bin. This is Woodstock Union High School. And you can see here that it is covered, but they've set up these pulley systems to make it easier to pull the covers off, or to pull the covers open. You can also see that they're using that slat system I talked about, where you just remove the slats from the front to get easy access into the material that's inside the bin. In this picture on the right, it looks like they're using this first bin maybe as a place for just gathering carbon materials like garden refuse. Here's a smaller version of the bin system. Instead of pulleys, it's the lids are counterweighted here. This is at Cornwall School in Vermont. At Bakersfield Elementary and Middle School, they're also using bins, but it's a smaller school, and they're just using a smaller bin system, but it's still the same principle. And you can see, even though the sides and the back aren't wooden, they're not made of those slats, it's lined with that hardware cloth, so rodents can't get into the compost bins. This is Howard University Compost Cooperative in DC. Here's the bin system again as well, some examples of signage and people there working the bins. This is one of those aerated compost bins that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the systems at St. John's University in New York City. And so here on the upper left picture is an O2 compost system which is a brand name, and it has a fan. It's motorized. You can't, in this picture, you can't really see the pipes that are going through. And again, even though these are much wider bins, so equipment can, a tractor can get in. It's, again, the front is these slats. They're long enough that they've put handles in, 2 sets of handles on each slat. So it's just easier for people to like lift up and out of the front of those bins. Here's their collection area in the top middle. Their collection area once they've gathered their food scraps. I think some of this is carbon as well. Here's their cafeteria setup when they're preparing the meals. It just goes right into these blue bins. They do have this compost turner, and they're utilizing it on their gardens, on their school gardens. These are images from Ramona Unified School District in California. They're integrating their compost system with food waste reduction efforts, outreach and education, as well as integrating it into the charitable food systems. So in one school year, they were able to reduce their food waste by almost 3,000 pounds. They grew enough food to provide over 7,000 pounds for people. Almost 4,000 pounds of food of the food scraps went to animals, and they composted just over 6,500 pounds. This actually in 2015 provided a cost benefit of over $18,000. So at the end of the system, whatever system you choose, often there's some type of screening involved just to get out those maybe bigger wood chips that are still in there that haven't broken down, or it might be that you have corn cobs or avocado pits, things that aren't quite done. You can screen them out, put them back in for another round. There are homemade screens, there are these round tumbler screens, and of course there are larger commercial screeners available, depending on the scale that you're composting at. So we've just looked at a bunch of pictures of different systems and how different places have set it up. Really, the first thing you want to be thinking about, or one of the first things you want to be thinking about when you're trying to decide on what kind of system will work best for you, is volume. So the best system is a balance of what you're trying to compost. So what is the volume of food scraps generated at your school? Of course, if it's just a classroom, it's going to be a small amount. If it's a cafeteria, it'll be more. If it's a small school or a big school, a lot of schools actually do on-site composting. A lot of schools in Vermont do on-site composting of most of the food scraps, but because they're also now using compostable plates and cups and flatware, things that you really need that hot compost to break down, and it's much bulkier, they're sending those materials to a local compost facility, commercial compost facility. So they're actually dividing their waste stream. One is being hauled away, and the other they're managing on site. So you need to think about how much of that, primarily it's going to be the green food scrap, so nitrogen-rich material. Remember that you need carbon to balance that, to get that correct carbon to nitrogen ratio for the compost system to work. And so how much do you have access to for the carbon? That could be dried leaves or yard clipping, wood chips, wood shavings, sawdust. If you have a shop class at your school, you might have something there that you could bring in. But if you have, you really need to have a handle on the amount of carbon that you have access to, because that may well be your limiting factor. We're going to get into recipe development in a little bit, but general rule of thumb is 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. A lot of schools also, at least in rural areas in Vermont, have access to manure. And so that would be another component to add into the recipe. And manure often comes mixed with bedding. And so that's a mix of nitrogen and carbon. And we'll talk more about that in detail later. The other really crucial piece of deciding on your system is the people power piece, or the management. How is it going to be managed? Is it going to be staff people, or is it a single teacher and, or maybe a whole grade? how big is your school? How many students are involved? Can you get parent volunteers engaged? So if you don't have a lot of management capacity, that's your other limiting factor. You don't want to be taking all this food scraps, but not have the people power or the equipment power to actually process it all. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. And a balance of all of these three things is going to cue you into what your ideal site capacity is and what type of your ideal systems that you're going to use. Let's talk a little bit more about siting and communication or signage. So when you're looking at the physical landscape of your school, or perhaps some land nearby your school, if it's not right on the school property, some of the things you want to be thinking about is there year-round accessibility? Now, interestingly, a lot of the community gardens that I work with who are doing composting they close down during the winter. And so winter accessibility is an issue. A lot of the school sites that I work with, it's actually the other way around. And they run right through the winter time, but then once summer's here and everybody goes away for until the school year starts again in the fall, what happens to your system then? Is there going to be someone managing it? Are you just going to be covering it in carbon and shutting it down for 3 months? Some sites that don't have easy winter access actually move a portion of their compost system to a winter location. They empty out the contents of a tumbler into their bin system and transport the tumbler to an area that can be easily plowed and maintained over the winter. As spring arrives, they empty out what has accumulated over the winter into a backyard type of bin to cure, and move the tumbler back to their primary compost site. For school sites that may not be operating in the summertime, it's fine to let the system rest. Just be sure that any actively composting material is well covered with carbon or soil before closing the site for the summer. If possible, check in on it every so often. Even if you have a really wet spell, as long as the system is close to the elements and is well covered, it shouldn't be a problem. When school's back in session, it's fun to go uncover the system and see what's happened while you were away. In terms of the recent pandemic and schools shutting down unexpectedly and for much longer, we'll be talking about contingency plans for that type of situation that's a bit unusual and unexpected later on. Other site considerations that you want to be thinking about are whether you need shrubbery or fencing, some kind of landscaping or cover to block wind, provide some insulation for winter, but two, as well, there's aesthetics involved. So depending on where you are, you want to be thinking about how your site can fit into the neighborhood that your school is in or the area that your school is in. What are the expectations of your community? There's also a landscaping aspect to discouraging wildlife. And there are whole webinars that you can listen to just on that we can provide links to. ILSR, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, has a number of them. But you want to be sure that you are doing some landscaping in terms of weed whacking, keeping taller grass away from your site because that can bring ticks, but it also gives a place for rodents and rats and other animals that you don't want in your system. It gives them a place to hide. And so it really is important to have a tidy site. You can set your bins or piles right on the ground in a grass or vegetated area. They can be built into a shed, placed on a cement pad or on gravel. Any of that is fine, depending on the site that you have available and materials you have available. For windrows and piles, just a specific note, you want it to be slightly sloped, like 2 to 5%. And part of this is in terms of if there is a big rainfall or if your system is overly wet, where's that runoff? So the leachate or contact water from the compost system going to go? And so you want to be able to direct that into a specific area. And that brings us to this slide, which talks about having either a buffer, swale, or some kind of filter around or behind piles. So again, if you have an open pile, even if it's covered with wood chips or soil or finished compost, if you get a big rainfall, there's likely going to be water coming out of your pile. Where does that go? You want to be sure that you know where it goes or where it's going to go, that it's not going to be directed accidentally into a wetland area, a neighbor's property, the road. So having some sense of slope is important. Shady, partial sun is the best. Having access to a water source can be handy. And then again, like I said, think about the importance of carbon and having enough carbon on hand. So think about not just where you're going to have your active composting, but where you're going to store your carbon materials. Or if you're getting manure from a local farmer, where is that going to be? You want to have those things kept dry. So you need to integrate that into your site design. We have developed a site inspection form that you have in your information packet, and this will help you just think through all of these different siting points that I've talked about. The last thing I'll talk about in terms of where to physically set up your site is setbacks, and this is going to vary depending on where you are, what your local zoning ordinances are. But general guidelines that are usually good rules of thumb are making sure that your site is no less than 3 feet from side lot lines, 10 feet from the front lot line, and 25 feet from the back lot line. You want adequate distance from wells or wetlands, surface water bodies, or floodplains. You want to operate it again to prevent drainage from compost piles going into water or neighboring properties. Just a note about cultural considerations. Some sites it may make perfect sense to have windrows or piles right out there. Maybe you have a field next to your school or next to the school garden. For other sites, there are cultural considerations in terms of what parents or school administration and staff expect your site to look like. Now that can be a little bit of extra cost potentially to set up initially. On the left here is the shed that was built for Charlotte Central School in Charlotte, Vermont. And on the right, it's a little bit more rustic, but similar idea of a shed in Ferrisburg Central School, also in Vermont. And so in these places that, the sheds blend into the other school structures, it looks like it belongs on the school property, in other words. And it also provides a windbreak. It provides a place for the students and teachers or whoever's managing your system to be out of the rain or the snow. In terms of communication, certainly signage, you want something like this of what you can add into your compost bin or the food scrap collection bins and what doesn't go in those bins at every site where there is collection. So that may mean signage that's in your classrooms if you're collecting snack time signs, or this year if you're doing lunches in classrooms to avoid overcrowding in cafeterias. Place where there's a food scrap bin, there should be a sign of reminding people what goes and what doesn't go. I've also seen signs where places people will add a blank piece of paper where people can peel off those produce stickers and stick them and see how many are they collecting. If your school is preparing meals in cafeterias, again, having some similar signage, just as a reminder for staff, can be super helpful. And then again, the same signs or similar signs at the compost system itself. So as your compost stewards, your students or staff or whoever's managing your site is emptying those food scrap buckets into the system, they can be looking for PLU stickers or bones or plastic or whatever it is that may not belong. And then having some type of signage on the bins. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Same for tumblers. Where do you add the food scraps? Where is your active pile? It's actively composting, but no more materials should be added yet. Where is your cure pile? If you have windrows, often people will actually draw a site plan with the windrows or have posts and signs saying, pile A, pile B. You can name them whatever works for your community. whatever works for your group. Have your students help name them. But understanding where each different pile or bin or tumbler or windrow is in the system is crucial to managing a system well. Where does food enter? Where is it actively composting? And where is it curing? You may also want to consider educational signage. So that could be in the classroom again, or at the, out at the bins. You can have your students help make different signs, thinking about like, how does compost happen? What does that process look like? Why are we doing it? What's important about diversion? Or how do we use the compost when it's done? There's all different ways, and the internet is full of examples. Many are just free templates that can be downloaded and printed and laminated, or again, you can engage students as part of the learning process in making some of this educational signage. Other communication considerations. I think I've mentioned most of this. So signage at all collection points, simple and concisely worded. We encourage the use of images as well as words. And depending on your school, really think about whether it should be multilingual or not. That could be really important for some communities. You may also want to consider, as you're starting a school composting program, to provide a flyer that students can send home or are mailed out perhaps to parents, letting them know that you have a new compost system and that their kids are learning about composting and organics diversion and soil health. A lot of what happens, or what we've seen happen at schools, is that students, as they're learning about this and as they're actively engaged in management of a compost system, they go home and they start asking questions like, why don't we compost? Why we should have a compost bin or a food scrap drop off or food scrap bin in our kitchen. And some parents really appreciate just sort of a heads up that this is happening. Other parents are already composting at home and on board with it. But it can be helpful for them to provide a little bit more detail than maybe their kids will provide to them about the program and how it's being run. This may especially be true in times of the pandemic, where parents may have some concern about the health and safety of managing food scraps. We're going to get into some health and safety guidelines later on. Just be thinking, though, about who do you need to be talking to about this. And then, of course, depending on who the champion at your school is for a composting system, you may need to work up the chain within the school administration to get approvals or to get buy-in for this program. So just remember all the different, make a list of all the different people who it would likely be good for them to hear about the program and understand the motivation of setting up this type of program at your school. And then there are additional communication systems that need to be set up for management of the compost system specifically. In terms of winter composting, it certainly can be done even here in New England with harsh winters. There is going to be some amount of freezing depending on how protected your system is, but that shouldn't deter you from doing it. So one of the sites that I work with, it's actually a Champlain Valley co-housing site in Charlotte, created this bin in a bin system for outdoor food scrap collection during the winter. So it's this larger bin. They have a bunch of wood shavings on the bottom as insulating material. And then they've built this circular insulating liner for the larger bin that a smaller bin fits inside of and lifts out of. And then they've also added some rigid insulation on the top that closes down over it. And so that's one way to think about it if you are doing any kind of food scrap collection outside. Another thing you can do if you're using larger totes or even just plastic bins like this one, if you do put those wood shavings at the bottom, even if the food scraps, which are often very moist, right, so they'll tend to freeze, with the wood shavings at the bottom, you can more easily tip it out at least into your system or onto a pad to break it up. And then there's all different kinds of ways of insulating your bins. A lot of bin designs that you can get don't include specifications for that, using rigid insulation. So you may want to just think about whether you want to include that and then alter the plans that you have accordingly for how to build the sites, or sorry, how to build your bins. The Jora tumbler is one of the tumblers that we use quite a bit in Vermont. It comes with this rigid white insulation in it. And it, the small ones are hard to keep from freezing, but the medium and large ones, as long as they're actively being used, the decomposition process inside these insulated chambers creates enough heat that it will continue to decompose and won't freeze solid. You can also use straw or hay to cover your windrows or piles, or whether that's loose and you're just using it as a full cover, or using hay bales around your piles is another way to do it. Now I'm going to be talking a little bit about worm composting in classrooms, starting small and starting indoors. That's a good way to go for some schools. So there are a lot of different ways to vermicompost or worm compost in the classroom. You can, make your own worm bin out of a plastic bin. You can purchase a stackable system. There's worm bags, which is like this fabric-y kind of bag that actually hangs that you can use. You need to understand the volume of food scraps your system can handle, or conversely, the approximate volume of food scraps you want your system to handle. So you have the number of worms that will be processing those scraps, and you have the correct volume, the correct home for that volume of worms to live in. So just like with the other compost systems that we've been talking about, you need to create the right environment, in this case for your worms. So light is a consideration. It shouldn't be overly light in the system, so some way of keeping it dark, or at least mostly dark. Temperature is a consideration. You don't want them to get too hot or too cold. They do need proper aeration and moisture, just like the other systems that we've been talking about. And then providing the right bedding, or layering of leaves or some other material for them to live in is an important piece. There are also some considerations in terms of what you feed your worm bin. Here's a list of what can go in and what should be either eliminated from the system, not included in the system, or included only in limited amounts, like citrus. Too much citrus can be a problem, but a lot of the same things can go into the worm bin as go into the other system. It is important to note that the worms are not vegetarians. They can eat meat, but especially in the classroom setting, we just caution people to not utilize meat or dairy products, primarily because they can cause some odors if not managed correctly. And it can also be an attractant for maybe mice or rats. So things that you definitely want to keep, but be sure to keep out of your worm bin in your classroom. But I wouldn't be overly concerned if someone had, a casserole that had a little bit of meat and it got in. I think that's fine. So just, no large volumes of that. The other note is to, once you set up your worm bins, don't begin feeding them immediately after you introduce them into their new home. Give them a few days, maybe a week, to acclimate to the bin environment. Then they will also be pretty hungry. So when you start adding material, they're going to be just eating through it immediately, which is really the sort of system you want to be setting up.